She could stitch a torn saddle blanket so clean you'd never find the wound. She could set a broken finger, close a knife cut, patch a coat worn down to threads, and make it hold another winter. Folks in the valley brought her everything they'd given up on, and she gave it back whole. But there was one thing she never once tried to mend. Herself. I watched that woman put the whole broken world back together with her 2 hands for the better part of 3 years, and in all that time I never saw her keep a single thing for her own. Not a coat, not a name she'd say out loud, not a future. So when the day finally came that I was the broken thing standing in her doorway, when a man who'd buried everything he ever loved worked up the nerve to ask her for something instead of thanking her for fixing it, I honestly didn't know if she'd have any yes left in her at all. This is the story of the mender, of the man who kept a ledger because he couldn't keep anything else, and of the one repair neither of us knew how to make. Stay with me till the end, because the last thing she said to me, I still haven't finished writing it down. The rain came down like it had a grievance to settle, and I was 3 miles from anything dry when I saw the light in her window. I want to be honest with you the way I'm honest with my ledger, which is to say I don't fix the numbers to make myself look better. So here's the plain truth of that night. I wasn't lost. I knew exactly where I was. I passed her cabin because I'd been passing it for 2 years the way the rest of the valley did, with my hat brim low and my eyes on the road, telling myself it was respect and knowing it was something closer to cowardice. That night I stopped because the calf across my saddle was dying, and I had nowhere else to take him. He was a spring calf, barely off the teat, and a coyote or a stray dog had opened his flank from hip to belly. I'd found him in the wash, half-drowned, bawling in that thin, cracked way animals get when they've decided the world is done with them. I'm a rancher. I've put down more suffering than I've saved. My hand was already on the pistol when something stopped it, the light in her window, warm and yellow through the rain, and the thought, stupid and sudden, she mends things. So I knocked on the door of the woman the whole valley called the Apache, and I did it holding a dying calf like an offering, which is about the most honest way a coward ever announced himself. She opened the door. I'd seen her before, of course, at a distance. In town, on the 2 or 3 days a season she came in for salt and needles, moving through the mud street inside a silence people made around her like a fence. She was younger than the stories made her sound and older than her face, if that makes sense, the kind of tired that's got nothing to do with years. Dark eyes that didn't flinch and didn't ask. She looked at me. She looked at the calf. She looked at the blood soaking down my coat. "Bring him to the table," she said, just that. Her English was clean, careful, each word set down like she'd paid for it and meant to get her money's worth. It surprised me, and I'm not proud of being surprised. Inside her cabin was 1 room, and it was the most orderly place I'd ever stepped foot in. I keep a ledger, so I notice order the way some men notice a pretty face. Everything hung in its place. Thread wound on carved spools by color, light to dark, like a rainbow somebody had disciplined. Needles in a folded cloth. Awls, a small bone-handled knife, a mortar stained green from grinding. Coats and shirts and blankets folded in a stack by the wall, each with a scrap of paper pinned to it, other people's broken things, waiting their turn. Bundles of dried plants hung from the rafters and turned the whole room the color of a memory. She swept a cloth across the table, and I laid the calf down, and he didn't even fight it. That was the worst part. He'd quit. "Hold his head," she said, and she went to work. I've watched men sew wounds in the field with a boot needle and whiskey and a lot of hollering. I'd never seen anything like her hands. She cleaned the wound first, didn't rush it, poured something over it from a clay jar that smelled sharp and green, wiped away the grit and the torn hair until she could see what she was working with. Then she threaded a curved needle, held the calf's flank together like she was closing a book, and started to stitch. Small, even, each pull firm and then gentle, firm and then gentle, a rhythm to it. She talked to the calf the whole time, not in English, low words in a language I didn't have, and I swear that little animal's breathing slowed to match her voice. Her hands never shook. There was a scar across the back of the left one, old and white, and I found myself watching it move, watching the way she'd learned to work around it. It took the better part of an hour. When she was done, she pressed a poultice over the line of stitches and bound it, and only then did she look up at me, and I realized I'd been holding my breath so long my chest hurt. "He may live," she said. "He wanted to quit. Sometimes they change their mind if you give them a reason." She wiped her hands. "You brought him a long way in the rain." Didn't have anywhere closer. Something moved at the edge of her mouth. Not a smile, the place a smile lives before it's earned. "No," she said, "you didn't." She let me stay till the rain eased, sat me by the fire with a tin cup of something bitter and hot, and she didn't fill the quiet with talk the way most folks can't help doing. She sat across from me mending a child's shirt by firelight, and I watched her needle go in and out, and I thought about how long it had been since I'd sat in a room with another living soul and felt like the silence was a kindness instead of a hole. My wife had been dead 2 years that month. Cora, I don't say her name much. I keep her in the ledger instead, which I know is a strange thing to admit. The last page she ever wrote in is still in there, a grocery list, flour and coffee and a bolt of blue cloth she never got to make into anything. I've read that list more times than the Bible. There's a kind of man who can talk about his grief, and there's a kind who can only add it up in a column and stare at the total. I'm the second kind. When the rain thinned to a drizzle, I stood to go. I reached for my coat and I heard myself say, "What do I owe you?" I regretted it the second it left my mouth. Her hands went still on the shirt. "For the calf," I said, quieter, trying to fix it. She looked at me for a long moment. "You brought me work," she said. "You gave me a reason to use my hands tonight instead of just sitting here listening to the rain. That is not something you owe me for." Then, because she saw I didn't understand, "But if it troubles you, you have sheep." "Sheep and cattle, some. Why?" "Wool," she said simply. "In the spring, that is a fair trade." I said all right. I said I'd remember. I put on my coat and I went out into the last of the rain and rode home, and I want you to understand, I wasn't a man in love. I was a man who'd been alone so long the ordinary kindness of another person landed on me like a rock through a window. That's a different thing. It took me a while to learn the difference and longer to stop being scared of it. The calf lived. I named him Lucky, which my hired man Abelardo said was a stupid name, and it was, but it was also a true one, so it stayed. Here is where I have to tell you about the valley, because you can't understand her, or what came later or the cost of it, without understanding the ground she was standing on. The valley was called Redemption, which is the kind of name settlers give a place to convince themselves of something. It sat where the high desert broke into grass, good land, watered land, and every acre of it had been Apache land inside of living memory. There were men in that valley who'd taken it. There were men who'd ridden with the militias in the bad years, who'd done the things the bad years asked of them and come home and built fences and gone to church and never spoke of it. There were widows in that valley whose husbands the Apache had killed, and there was truth in their grief too, real and sharp, because that's how these things always are. The wound goes both directions and everybody's bleeding and everybody's certain they bled first. And into all of that, the woman I'll call Netta had walked alone and stayed. I say the woman I'll call Netta because that wasn't her name. It was what the valley called her, a flattening of something longer they couldn't be bothered with. Her true name she kept. I learned that early, that among her people a name was not a thing you handed out to strangers, that it was closer to a soul than a label. For 2 years I called her Netta because I didn't know I hadn't earned the other. When I finally did, it was one of the great gifts of my life, and I'll get to it. Where her people had gone I only pieced together in fragments, over months, never in one telling. There'd been a band of them in these mountains. There'd been the wars and the surrenders that weren't honored, and the long forced walk east to Florida that the government called relocation, and everybody who survived it called something with no gentleness in it. Men, women, children, loaded onto trains and shipped across a continent to a swamp fort where the coughing sickness took them by the score. She'd been on those trains. She didn't say how she got off them, or how she came back, or what she came back to, which was nothing, a valley full of other people's fences where her family's fires used to be. She could have gone anywhere. She stayed here. I asked her once later, why here, why the one place that would never let her forget, and she gave me an answer I've turned over 10,000 times since. A broken thing can be carried far away, she said, and it is still broken. I did not want to be carried anywhere. I wanted to sit down in the place where the tear is and see if my hands still worked. That was Netta. She mended for a living because it was the only work the valley would give an Apache woman, and she was extraordinary at it because I came to believe. It was the only prayer she had left, and she said it with a needle over other people's ruined things every single day because she couldn't say it over her own. Word of her hands got around the way it does. Folks who wouldn't nod to her in the street would send a child up the hill with a coat that couldn't be replaced and a coin folded in a rag. She fixed it. She always fixed it. There was a hard little justice in it that I don't think she missed. The same valley that had no room for her at its table couldn't get through a winter without her stitches. I started finding reasons to go up the hill. I'm not going to pretend I was smooth about it. I'm a widower who counts things for comfort. Smooth was never in my range. But I had wool coming in spring, and I made sure to bring some of it early. I had a tear in my saddle, and I made a whole event of it. I had, God help me, socks. I brought her socks to mend that I could have thrown out, and she'd take them and look at me with those steady eyes like she could read the whole clumsy ledger of my loneliness right off my face, and she never once made me feel small about it. She'd just say, "Sit," and I'd sit, and she'd work, and we'd talk or not. I told her about Cora, first person I'd said her name to in 2 years, and it came out of me like a stone I'd swallowed. Netta listened. She didn't tell me time heals or that Cora was in a better place or any of the things people say to fill the silence around a grieving man. She said, "You keep her in your book of numbers." She'd seen the ledger. I took it everywhere. "I do," I said. "Is that crazy?" "No," she said. She thought about it. Needle paused. "You are afraid that if you stop counting her, she will be gone, but she is already gone, Eli. The counting keeps you from being gone. That is different. That is not crazy. That is a man holding onto the edge of a thing so he does not fall in." I had to go outside after that. Stood in her yard looking at the mountains until my eyes cleared. When I came back in, I didn't say anything about it, and neither did she. And she poured me more of the bitter tea, and that was how she handled a man's dignity. She'd set the true thing down in front of you plain as a mended coat, and then she'd give you room to pick it up in private. That was the winter I stopped passing her cabin with my eyes on the road. That was the winter the trouble started, too, though I didn't know it yet. It started small, the way rot does. A word in town. Somebody's mule died and somebody remembered she'd sold that somebody a poultice. Nothing to do with anything. But there's a kind of man in every valley who needs a reason for his misfortune that isn't himself. And there was a man like that in ours, and his name was Harlan Voss, and he'd buried a wife in the bad years, and he'd been feeding a fire in his chest for 20 years waiting for a place to put it. I'll tell you about Harlan Voss. But first I have to tell you about the night the boy came down the hill in the dark, soaked in blood that wasn't his, and hammered on my door, and told me a man was dying on Netta's table, and that the man was one of the ones who'd hunted her people. Because that was the night I learned what she was made of, and it was the night I understood, finally and completely, that whatever this was between us, it was going to cost more than wool. The boy's name was Tamaz. He couldn't have been 10. He'd run 3 miles in the dark to get me, and the first thing he said, gasping, wasn't help, it was "she won't stop." And I didn't understand what he meant until I got up that hill and saw it with my own eyes. She won't stop. I rode up that hill in the black of a moonless night with Tamaz clinging on behind me, and the whole way his words went round in my head like a stone in a boot. She won't stop. I thought the man on her table must be past saving and she wouldn't quit trying. I thought it was mercy I was riding toward. It was mercy, it just wasn't the kind I was braced for. The cabin was lit up like a lantern. Through the window I could see her bent over the table, and even from the yard I could see the blood, more blood than the calf. More blood than seemed possible to lose and still have a man on the table instead of under the ground. I came through the door, and the smell hit me first, copper and smoke and that green sharp poultice smell. And then I saw the man's face and my stomach turned all the way over. I knew him, everybody in the valley knew him. He rode for Harlan Voss, and before that, in the bad years, he'd ridden with the militia, one of the ones who'd done the hunting. His name was Del Cutter, and he was a mean drunk and a meaner sober man, and somebody had put 2 bullets in him outside the saloon over a card game or a woman or nothing at all. And his own people had loaded him on a horse and pointed it up the hill because Netta was closer than the doctor 40 miles off. And then they'd ridden away and left him. They'd left a dying man on the doorstep of a woman whose family he'd helped destroy. And they'd done it because they knew, the whole valley knew, that she would open the door. She had her hands inside him when I came in. I mean that plainly. She had one hand pressed into the meat of his shoulder, holding something closed and the other working by feel. And her face was wet, and her jaw was set, and she was saying those low words in her own tongue, the same ones she'd said to the calf, over the body of the man who'd hunted her. "Eli," she said, not looking up, Boil water, there the kettle, and the flat pan of tools, put them in the water, quickly. I did what she said. I didn't think. You don't think in a room like that. You just move where the person with the steady voice points you. Tamaz huddled in the corner with his knees to his chest. Del Cutter made a sound like a hinge. For an hour, maybe more, we fought for the life of a man I'd have crossed the street to avoid, and Netta led that fight, and I have never in my life seen anything like it, and I fought fires and floods and a rope that broke while three of us held a bull. She got one bullet out. The other was too deep and too near something that would kill him faster than the lead, so she left it and closed around it. She stitched what could be stitched. She packed what couldn't. She kept his blood inside him by will and skill and those two scarred hands. And somewhere in the middle of it, his eyes came open and found her face, and I watched him realize whose table he was on. I watched Del Cutter, who'd hunted her people, look up into the face of the Apache woman keeping him alive, and I watched the fear come into his eyes, not fear of dying. Fear of her. Fear of what she might do now that she had him open on a table. And I watched her see that fear, and I watched something cross her face that I have never had a good word for. It wasn't anger, though she'd have earned anger. It wasn't forgiveness, which would have been a lie. It was something harder and cleaner than either. It was a decision. Be still, she told him in English so he'd understand. I am not him. I am not what you were. Be still. And he was still. Here is the morally heavy thing, and I want to lay it out plain because it's the center of everything, and I've never told it straight before. There was a moment, I saw it, where her hands paused, where she had this man's life balanced on the edge of her own two palms, and she could have let it slide off, and no one, not one soul in that valley or the next, could have proved she did it on purpose. A dying man is a dying man. Bullets do what bullets do. She'd have been thanked for trying. She had every reason the world hands out. She had a whole train full of reasons, and a swamp full of graves, and a valley of fences where her fires used to be. And her hands started moving again. She saved him. Afterward, when Del Cutter was breathing on his own, and Tamaz had gone home, and the gray light was coming up over the mountains, I stood in her yard while she washed the blood off her arms in the horse trough, the water going pink and then clear, and I asked her the only question I had. Why? She was quiet so long I thought she wouldn't answer. The scar on her left hand caught the early light. When they took us east, she said finally, on the trains, a soldier gave my mother his blanket, one soldier in a whole army of them. She was coughing, and he gave her his blanket, and he never told anyone, and he never asked for it back, and I never learned his name. She wrung the water from her sleeves. I have hated a great many men, Eli. I have earned everyone. But I decided on that train that I would not become a person who could not tell the difference between an army and a man. If I let that one die on my table because of what his kind did, then his kind wins. They make me into them. She looked at me. I mend things. That is who I am. If I choose who is worth mending, I am no longer a mender. I am only another person deciding who gets to live. This valley has enough of those. I didn't have anything to say to that. There isn't anything to say to that. It's the truest thing anyone ever said in my hearing, and I've spent the rest of my life trying to be worth having heard it. What I didn't understand yet, what neither of us understood, was that saving Del Cutter was the thing that broke everything open. Because a man like Del Cutter can't live owing his life to a woman like Netta. It sits in him wrong. And a man like Harlan Voss can't have one of his own alive by Apache mercy, because it makes the whole story he's told himself for 20 years come apart at the seams. They needed her to be a threat, so they made her one. It started, like I said, small, a word in town. By the time Del Cutter could ride again, the word had grown. The story going around wasn't that Netta had saved his life. The story was that she'd had him helpless and cut him, that the bullet still in his shoulder was one she'd put there, not one she'd spared him from, that she'd worked some kind of medicine on him, that he wasn't right since, that he had dreams. Del Cutter never said any of this himself, to his credit or his shame. He just didn't say the other thing, the true thing, and his silence was a field and Harlan Voss planted it. I know how this sounds. I know from the far side of all these years how plain the cruelty of it is. But you have to understand how a valley works. A story doesn't have to be true. It only has to be usable. And a valley that had taken everything from a people and built its churches on the taking. That valley needed the Apache woman on the hill to be dangerous. Because if she wasn't dangerous, if she was just a woman who mended coats and saved the lives of men who'd hunted her, then what did that make the men who'd done the hunting? What did it make the fences? What did it make them? Easier to burn the question than answer it. The first thing was her garden. Someone rode through it in the night and trampled the whole of it flat, the plants she grew for her medicine, the food she grew for herself, months of work churned into mud. I found her the next morning kneeling in the wreck of it, and she wasn't crying, she was salvaging, moving through the ruin, picking out the few plants that might live, replanting them one by one, her hands filthy to the wrist. Mending, even that, even then. "Netta," I said, "come stay at my place just till this passes." "It will not pass," she said, not looking up. "And I will not be run off my ground by men on horses in the dark. My people were run off this ground by men on horses in the dark. I am done being run." She set a plant in the earth and firmed the soil around it. "But thank you, Eli, for the offering." The next thing was a dead dog left on her step. Then a broken window. Then Harlan Voss himself, riding up the hill with 4 men behind him in the middle of the afternoon so the whole valley could see it, to tell her, in words I won't repeat in front of me, because by then I was there most days, that she had until the first frost to be gone. I stepped between them. I'm not a big man and I'm no fighter, and there were 5 of them, but I stepped between them anyway, because a man reaches a point where he'd rather take the beating than watch, and I'd reached it. "She saved your man's life, Harlan," I said. "You know she did, Cutter knows it. You're building a fire out of a lie, and you know that too." Harlan Voss looked at me the way you'd look at a dog that had learned a new trick. "Rourke," he said, "you've buried 1 wife already. You in a hurry to have the whole valley talking about the second one. An Apache. You think anybody'll sit at your table, do business with you, let their children near your place once you've taken up with that?" He leaned down over his saddle horn. "I'm doing you a kindness you're too lovesick to see. First frost, or we'll see to it ourselves." And they rode off, and left the words hanging in the yard like the smell of the dead dog. Here is the thing I have to confess, because I promised you I keep an honest ledger. For one long night at my own kitchen table with the lamp burning down, I did the arithmetic Harlan Voss wanted me to do. I sat there and I counted the cost. The ranch that was finally, after Cora, coming back to something. The business I did with men who wouldn't do it with a man who'd married Apache. The place I had in the valley, small as it was, that a man clings to. I counted it all up in the ledger like I count everything, and I sat there and I looked at the total and I understood, with a shame that's never fully left me, that a part of me was doing the sum Harlan wanted, that a part of me was afraid. And then I turned back a page in that same ledger, the way I do 100 times a year, to Cora's last grocery list. Flour, coffee. A bolt of blue cloth she never got to make into anything. And I thought about all the things I never said and never did because I thought there'd be time, because I was busy, because I was careful, because I was counting instead of living. I thought about the blue cloth folded in a drawer for 2 years because I couldn't bear to give it away and couldn't bear to look at it. And I thought about Netta kneeling in her trampled garden, replanting 1 stalk at a time. About her hands inside a man who'd hunted her people, choosing to be a mender instead of a judge. About a soldier's blanket and a name she never learned. She had lost everything the world can take from a person, and she was still choosing, every single day, to put broken things back together. And I was sitting at a warm table with a working ranch, afraid of what the neighbors would say. I closed the ledger. I got up before dawn, and I did the first brave thing I'd done in 2 years, which was also, I'd learn, the most foolish and the most important, and I've never once been sorry for it, even in the worst of what came after. I took the blue cloth out of the drawer, and I rode up the hill in the cold to ask a woman who had every reason to say no whether she'd let me build something with her, in a valley that would never allow it. And I got there just in time to find out that the first frost had come early, and Harlan Voss was not a man who waited on his own deadlines. There was smoke on the hill. I saw it from a mile off, a thin gray line going up into the cold morning, wrong, too much for a cook fire, too little for the whole cabin, which meant they'd started something and it hadn't caught the way they wanted, or somebody'd stopped it. I put my heels to the horse with the blue cloth still folded in my saddlebag and Cora's ring in my breast pocket, and every careful thing I'd ever been left behind me in the dust. They'd fired her woodshed. Not the cabin, the shed, the winter's wood, which in that country in that season is nearly the same as firing the cabin, just slower. And they were still there. 3 of Harlan's men, Del Cutter not among them, on horseback in her yard, watching it burn, and Netta standing in front of her own door with a shovel in her hands. Not running. Standing, 1 woman with a shovel against 3 mounted men, in front of a door she would not leave. And I understood in that moment that she'd meant every word, that they would have to kill her to move her, and that they might. and that she'd decided that was a price she'd pay before she'd be run off her ground one more time in her one short life. I came into that yard yelling, I don't even know what. I had an old rifle I mostly used on coyotes, and I had a voice, and I had 2 years of grief turned suddenly, gloriously into rage. And I put myself and my horse between Netta and Harlan's men, and I told them what would happen to the first one who moved. And I meant it. And they could see I meant it. And that's a thing that changes the arithmetic even for hard men. 3 to 1 is easy. 3 to 2 when one of them's got a rifle, and nothing left to lose, is a different sum. It could have gone bad. It should have, by rights. What saved us, and I've thought about this every day since, is that while we stood there in that frozen standoff, a fourth rider came up the hill. Del Cutter. He rode up slow, favoring the shoulder that would never be right again, and he looked at the burning shed, and he looked at the men who rode for the same brand he did, and he looked at Netta standing in front of her door with a shovel. And he got down off his horse. He got down off his horse and he walked over slow, hurting, and he stood next to her, facing the men he rode with. And he said in that gravel voice, loud enough for the whole cold morning to hear. She pulled a bullet out of me with her own hands and packed the other one so it wouldn't kill me. She had me open on her table, and she could have let me die and told Harlan I was gone before she got to me, and not a soul would have known different. He worked his jaw. I've let you all believe a lie because I couldn't stand what the truth made me. That ends today. This woman saved my life, and any man that means to burn her out is going to have to come through the fella she saved to do it. I have seen a few holy things in my life. I count that as one of them, and I don't use that word loose. Harlan's men didn't have it in them for that. Burning a woman's woodshed is one thing. It's a coward's work and it takes a crowd. But facing down one of your own, a man the whole valley knew and the wounds to prove it, standing shoulder to shoulder with the woman you came to run off, there was no story that made them the good men in that. They cursed, and they threatened, and Harlan Voss's name got invoked like a god who'd surely smite us. And then they rode down the hill, because that's what that kind does when the story stops working. We put out what was left of the fire, the 4 of us, hauling trough water till our arms gave out. Saved maybe a third of the wood. Del Cutter worked till his shoulder started bleeding through his shirt again, and Netta made him sit down and, without a word about anything, cleaned it and bound it fresh. Right there in the smoke-stinking yard, the mender mending, and neither of them said a single thing about what had just happened between them, and neither of them had to. When he could ride, he rode. At the edge of the yard, he stopped and turned in the saddle. I can't undo the years, ma'am, he said. I know that. I ain't fool enough to ask for anything. And Netta said, no, you cannot undo them, but you got down off your horse. A man is what he does when it costs him. Go home, Del Cutter. And he went, and I never saw him again because he left the valley inside the month, left Harlan's brand, left the whole country, went north somewhere to be a different man in a place that didn't already know his name. Some people can only mend somewhere else. She'd have understood that better than anyone. Then it was just the 2 of us in the ruined yard, in the cold, with the shed still smoking, and everything I'd ridden up there to say sitting like a stone in my chest. And I want to tell you I said it well. I'd like this part of the ledger to read better than it does. But I'm honest, so I stood there covered in soot and shaking from the fight going out of me, and I pulled the blue cloth out of my saddlebag, Cora's blue cloth, folded soft, and I held it out to her with 2 hands like a fool holding out his whole opened chest. And I said, this was my wife's. She never got to make anything out of it. I've kept it 2 years because I couldn't stand to look at it and couldn't stand to lose it, which I've come to understand is how I've lived my whole life, and I'm tired of it, Netta. I'm so tired of it. My voice went to nothing. You spend your days putting other people's broken things back together and you never keep a thing for yourself. Well, I'm broken. I've been broken 2 years and no needle's going to fix it. But I thought maybe 2 broken things could. I don't know how to say this. I've got a ledger full of everything I'm afraid to lose and not one single thing I chose. I want to choose something. I want to choose you. I'm asking you to build something with me. A future. Here or somewhere else if here won't have us. I don't care anymore what the valley says. I did the sum all night and the valley isn't worth what you're worth. Nothing is. I ran out of words, held out the blue cloth, stood there. She looked at it for a long time. Long enough that I felt every year of my age and every mile of my foolishness. Her hands, those scarred, sure, extraordinary hands that never shook over a wound, her hands were trembling now, just slightly, and that undid me more than anything because I understood that of all the broken things in all the valley, the one thing she'd never once tried to mend, never once let herself want, was this. A future. A place. A person who'd stand in her yard. Eli, she said, and her voice wasn't steady either. You do not know what you are asking, not the whole of it. If you build with me, you build in the wind. There will always be a Harlan Voss. There will always be a burning shed. I cannot promise you soft years. I don't want soft years, I said. I had soft years. I was too scared to feel them. I want the ones with you in them. She took the cloth. She held it against herself. And I'll carry this to my grave, it's the last true entry in the ledger of that year, she said her name to me. Her real one. The long one, the one the valley never bothered with, the one that was closer to her soul than to her label. She said it, and then she told me what it meant. And it meant the one who makes whole again. And she'd carried that name through the trains and the swamp fort and the fences and the fires. A mender before she ever held a needle. And she gave it to me in her ruined yard as the answer to a question I'd been too much of a coward to ask for 2 years. I'm not going to write the name down. Some things you keep out of the ledger. Some things are yours. We built the future. Not the one Harlan wanted for us, not the one the valley thought fit. A hard one in the wind, like she promised. There were more burning sheds before there were fewer. There were years the valley wouldn't sit at our table, and then, slow as a wound closing, years it did, because a valley is only people, and people can be mended too, though they're the hardest work of all, and you don't always live to see the stitches hold. She kept mending till her hands couldn't. Folks brought her the whole broken world, and she gave it back whole, right to the end, and she taught me some of it, enough that when she was gone I could take up the work myself, badly, my stitches never as fine as hers, but holding. Holding is enough. Holding is the whole thing. I'm an old man now. I keep the ledger still. Cora's grocery list is still in it. Flour and coffee and a bolt of blue cloth, and a few pages on there's another entry in a hand steadier than mine, a list Netta made once of the plants in her garden and what each one mends. I read them both. I keep them both. A man holds onto the edges of the things he loved so he doesn't fall in. She told me that the first winter, and she was right, and she was also, I came to learn, the edge itself, the thing that pulled me back out.